is Roman numeral 2, the West and Sectionalism. The main key point of these notes, the main idea to think of as we go through these slides, is every time we add land out west, the question is going to be, is that land going to be free or slave? Hence, sectionalism. The picture we see is Stephen Douglas. His nickname is the Little Giant. He is going to be a very powerful politician, hence giant, but he's also very short, so that's the little part. But what we're going to talk about him as is Mr. Popular Sovereignty. That's my nickname for him. Popular sovereignty, you see on his shield, it's going to be one of the main concepts that we talk about in dealing with land out west and the question of slavery or not. So, the Mexican Cession. If you remember from our last lecture, the Mexican Cession is all the land we acquire from the Mexicans after the Mexican-American War. So let's take a look at that land. On this map, it's that taupe color on the left. And so what we're going to do, previous compromises, let's do a quick review of all the land America gets as we go through the history, through our history or most of it, and talk about the issue of slavery. Every time we add land, the question is going to be, is that land free? Is that land slave? So the yellow on the map is what the United States looks like after the American Revolution. It says the United States in 1783. Once we get that land from the United States, from the British, we have to decide, is that land going to be free or slave? And so what Congress does is they do the Northwest Ordinance, which says the Ohio River is going to be the boundary, and north of it is going to be free, south of it is going to be slave. Then we get the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Thomas Jefferson, and of course we have to answer the question, is that going to be free or slave? So if you remember, the Missouri Compromise draws a line across the Louisiana Purchase, and it says everything north of the 3630 line is going to be free, everything south is going to be slave. Once again, we see Congress taking action. And now we have the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession, as I said, comes from the Mexican-American War, but you guessed it, the question that pops up is number one there, will this land be free or slave? And so we see in the past, Congress has made the decision, will that also be the case in the Mexican Cession? All right. Next, neither party wants to deal with the issue. This is such a contentious issue, slavery in the territories, that no major party wants to tackle it. If you come out and say no slavery in the territories, then you're going to anger the South. If you come out and say yes slavery in the territories, then you're going to ruin your party and anger people in the North. And so politicians just try to ignore it. They try to push the issue off. Next, and so what we see is we see the rise of a third party. We always see third parties come out in America when we have a major issue that neither political party is willing to address. And so the Free Soil Party certainly says what we want to do is we want to ban slavery in the new territories. Of course, it comes out in 1848, this party, because we just added the Mexican Cession, and so that's why it's a big issue. The Free Soil Party is not worrying about angering Southerners because they are only a sectional party. People who belong to the Free Soil Party are northern farmers. Now, why do northern farmers care about slavery in the territories? It's not for moral reasons. They are not abolitionists. The only reason that farmers in the North care about slavery in the territories is for economic reasons. If you're a farmer in Iowa or Illinois on the map, and you see that we just got this huge chunk of land out west, you want to be able to get there and be able to farm it. But the problem is, if you open that land up to slavery, plantation owners are going to rush out there, and they have the money to buy up all the good land, and so the northern farmers are not going to get very good land. And so the Free Soil Party is formed as a way for northern farmers to ensure that they're going to get the best land possible out west. So that's why they don't like the spread of slavery. And again, the Free Soil Party is not an abolitionist party. They don't care about slavery where it is. They just don't want it to expand. All right, next, we're going to talk about Eureka. So what you see is a close-up map of California. In 1848, we just got California away from the Mexican government, so it's a brand new U.S. territory. Not a lot of Anglo-Americans living there. It's mostly Native Americans and Mexican Americans. And so our story is right in the middle of this map. It starts at this place called Sutter's Mill or Sutter's Fort. This is just a log mill where they, turn logs into 2x4s, that kind of thing. And one of the guys you see in the bottom left-hand corner, he's taking his break from working in the mill, and he goes down at the stream, and he sees this gold, shiny substance, and he bites it, and sure enough, it is gold. And so he screams, according to legend, Eureka! And so now we know that there is gold in California. And so he does this discovery in 1848, right after the United States gets California from Mexico. And so the rush is on to get to California. So we call these people who rush out to get to California California, 49ers. They are called 49ers because even though gold is discovered in 1848, the rest of America is not going to find out until 1849. So let's go back the slide for just a second. And so there are two ways to get to Sutter's Mill, and this kind of colored area you see on the map, that's where all the gold is going to be. There are two ways to get here. Easterners can either go overland on the Oregon Trail to get to California. The problem with that is that it takes 6 months, and you want to get out to California as quick as possible so the gold doesn't run out. So a lot of Americans, what they did is they got on boats and they went all the way down around South America and then back up the coast, and they landed in San Francisco. Even though this is a longer route, it's shorter by time. So San Francisco is going to be a boom town. Lots of prospectors, miners are going to come into San Francisco, buy their supplies, and then go up into the hills looking for gold. And so, of course, that's where we get the sports team, the San Francisco 49ers. That's what they're named for. And so we see these 49ers, they come in, and as you know from your reading, most of the people who come out to the gold mines of California, they're young, single males hoping to make it rich quick. And so overnight, towns spring up in the gold mines of California. There was nobody there. 6 months later, there may be 50,000 miners living there at these tent cities. And so these are young, testosterone-filled men that are armed, that are away from home, that are looking to get rich quick. And so we see a lawless atmosphere result. It's the Wild West. We see gunfights, we see prostitution, we see saloons, we see theft, right? And there's just, the towns came about so quickly that there was not a chance to build jails or elect sheriffs or anything of that nature, and so we do see the Wild West. So how many of these prospectors actually made it rich? Well, less than 1%. Most of these prospectors, they will find a little bit of gold, but they won't find enough to make themselves rich. The people who do make it rich, though, are going to be people who, quote-unquote, mine the miners. These are going to be people who sell supplies to the miners, who sell mining equipment, hats, clothing, whiskey, prostitution, all of these things, they're going to make it rich. And the most famous example, if we can go back to that last slide again, is going to be a San Franciscoan. He lives in San Francisco, and all of these miners are coming in to go up to the gold fields, or miners are coming out of the gold fields to spend their gold or money that they've accumulated. And so he sees that a lot of these miners have tattered clothing. They're ripped, they're shredded, because mining is hard on your clothes, especially your pants. It rips it up with all these rocks. And he looks out in the harbor of San Francisco, and he sees all of these ships with their canvas sails. And he thought, well, that's a good, tough material. And so he starts experimenting with the canvas. He dyes it blue, and he starts to make jeans. And, of course, this guy's name is Levi Strauss, Strauss. And so he makes his fortune creating these new things called blue jeans. And he's always an example of some of these people who make it rich mining the miners. Next, let's talk about environmental destruction. This is a new and growing theme among APUS historians. And so we see with all of these miners coming out, they don't care about the environment. They cut down trees to make sluices, which is what you can see in the middle of the picture up above. That's what you channel the water down and see if there's any gold in it. They cut down trees to open up their towns, to build their towns. They dig deep into the Sierra Nevada mountains, bringing all kinds of harsh minerals out to light to be eroded away into the water, into the streams, killing the wildlife. And so we see lots of environmental destruction here. Later on, as we get to the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of the easily accessible gold will be mined out. And so we see companies come in and they start to use this stuff called hydromining. You can see it in the bottom picture. Hydro, of course, means water. And so what they do is they just speed up the erosion process by spraying millions and millions of gallons of water on the mountainside, eroding it away, washing it away, and what's left is the heavy gold that doesn't wash away. Of course, this is a great way to get rich and to find gold, but it does destroy the environment. As you can see, it's going to take years for the plants to grow back because they have just literally washed away all of the topsoil that's on that mountainside. So we see lots of environmental destruction. Next, we see impact of this California gold rush on minorities, specifically Native Americans. Now, when California was part of the Spanish Empire and then later part of Mexico, we know that Latinos or descendants of the Spanish, they first, of course, conquered the Indians, but then they didn't want to kill them anymore. They used them as laborers. They wanted to convert them to Catholicism. And if you remember, we saw the Mexicans or the Spanish using the natives as labor and also making them settle around missions and converting them to Catholicism. But when miners come out, they just see the Native Americans as in the way. And so we see Native Americans die because of conflict. They lose more of their land. They're put on reservations. And some of them even are used as unwilling indentured servants, almost like slave labor in the gold fields. So the gold boom was not certainly a positive thing for Native Americans. Next, Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans. Just a year ago, this was part of Mexico, and now it's part of the United States. So what does that mean for Mexicans who are living in now present-day America? There are some Mexicans who had huge haciendas, huge ranches. They had businesses, they had farms, they had haciendas, and they're very nervous. When Americans move into the region, they are going to take a lot of these possessions away from the Mexican inhabitants. They're going to take the land because maybe there's gold on it, or they're going to steal their businesses or their homes. And so we see that the United States government, of course, is going to side if there's a dispute with the American citizens rather than the Mexican American citizens. And so this is not a good thing, a positive thing for Hispanics in California. Next, we see thousands and thousands of Chinese, and you can see them in the top right picture, come in to California looking for gold, looking for jobs. They're also attracted by the gold rush. The problem is they're going to face racism by the white Americans. They're not going to have very much money, and so a lot of them don't own their own mines. What they do is they work for the Anglo miners, or they never get out of San Francisco even. They get stuck in San Francisco instead of the gold mines, and they end up working on the docks, or they're in laundries, or in restaurants, menial jobs that don't make a lot of pay. Even today, we can see evidence of this. San Francisco is famous for its Chinatown, a large group of Chinese immigrants who settle and stay in San Francisco. Of course, the last issue that deals with the gold rush is statehood. California, like I said, just a year ago was part of Mexico, and now thousands of Americans move in for the gold, and now California has enough people to apply for statehood. They've quickly gone through the territory status of a new piece of land, and now they have enough white people to apply for statehood. Of course, the question is, will California be a free or a slave state? So that gets us to big letter B, issues in the year 1850. Number one, control over the government. California is applying for statehood, as we said on the last slide, and most of the people who came out for the gold rush are going to be coming from the north. So they want California to be a free state. However, we won't have to count all the states. At this point, there is 15 slave states, there's 15 free states, not including California, and so the South realizes that if California comes in as a free state, they're going to lose control or that sectional balance in the Senate. And of course, we know from previous lectures that they don't want this to happen. They're afraid that if this happens, then the North will somehow get rid of slavery because they control the House and the Senate. And so it's critical for the South that California becomes in as a slave state. The District of Columbia, our second issue in 1850. Not only are we debating about what California should be, a free or a slave state, but we're also debating about the idea of slavery in our nation's capital, the District of Columbia. Many Northerners, even people who are not abolitionists, are concerned about this issue. It's symbolic that when a visitor comes from another country and they come to our nation's capital, they see human beings bought and sold in the streets of Washington, D.C. And it's embarrassing. It makes us look hypocritical. Here we are, a country that say we're founded for freedom and liberty, but yet human beings can be bought and sold in the streets of our nation's capital. And so there is a growing movement in the North, even among people who are not abolitionists, that we need to at least stop the slave trade in our nation's capital, where we buy and sell human beings out in public. Nobody's really advocating for the destruction of slavery as an institution in Washington, D.C. or the rest of the South, except for a few abolitionists. They just want to get rid of this very onus, very in-your-face aspect of slavery where we see human beings being bought and sold. And of course, the South is against this. They don't want anybody to make any laws against destroying any part of slavery. They think it's kind of that slippery slope argument. And if the North passes a law to get rid of just the slave trade in Washington, D.C., soon it would be slavery in Washington, D.C., and then slavery everywhere. And so the South will not compromise on this issue. So we have lots of sectional issues arising in 1850. Our next issue is the concept of fugitive slaves. Now, there have long been laws on the books in the United States that if a slave runs away from the South with the Underground Railroad and they escape up north of the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line, the South has every right to come into the North and capture those runaway slaves. These are the fugitive slave laws that give them permission to do this. But the Northerners don't like this. What they see is scenes what you see before you. If you're a Northerner walking down the street, let's say you're not an abolitionist, and all of a sudden you hear gunfire, you hear dogs, you hear yelling, and you look and you see African Americans running for their lives, running away from the slave catchers. And white people up north just simply don't want to see this scene. They don't, most of them have any problem with slavery in the South, but they don't want to see the ugly face of slavery in the North. They don't want to see human beings being carted and caught and chained up. And so they say to the South, look, you guys can have slavery if you want, but we certainly don't want you to let your slave catchers come up here because we don't want to look at this. We don't want your slavery and your institutions to come up here into the North. And so we see Northerners not helping the South enforce the fugitive slave laws. And this is a bone of contention with the South. The laws clearly state that the North cannot interfere with catching slaves. They have to help the South catch their slaves, and the North is just not following this. And so the South is demanding that the North help them catch their fugitive slaves. So this is our third really contentious issue. All of this is an example of the sectionalism that is rampant in America in 1850. And so to avoid civil war, we have to come up with a compromise. And so what we get in Section C is the Compromise of 1850, our attempt, led by Henry Clay and others, to come up with a way to solve these three issues that we just talked about so America can move forward united together. So the first part of the Compromise of 1850 is that California is going to come in as a free state. Like I said, most of the people that moved there because of the gold rush are going to be people who did not bring slaves, did not own slaves, and so California will come in as a free state. And so now we have sectional imbalance in the Senate. The North has more free states than the South has slave states. So why would the South agree to this compromise? Well, as we will see, the South is going to get things that they like as part of this compromise. The next part of the compromise is that we are going to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Not slavery, but just the buying and selling of slaves. Now, of course, this makes Northerners feel good because when visitors come to our nation's capital, they're not going to see human beings bought and sold. Of course, the South doesn't like this. They think that what's next? We're going to outlaw slavery altogether in the rest of America. And so we see of the Compromise of 1850, the first two agreements go the North's way. The next agreement, of course, is going to be something that benefits the South, though. And that is that we're going to have popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession. So let me explain what that means. Of course, we know the Mexican Cession is on this map. We see the Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory. Those together is the Mexican Cession. And we are always asking the question, is it going to be free or slave? Well, California, as we know, is now going to be a free state. But what about all the rest of the land we got from the Mexican-American War? As you see on the map, the Utah and New Mexico territories. And so as part of the Compromise of 1850, Congress says that we're going to let the people themselves who live in those regions, those territories, decide if they're going to be free or slave. Popular sovereignty means people decide. And so this is, so for in the future, whether it's Nevada or Utah or New Mexico or Arizona, we're saying that those people who live there get to decide, not Congress. For the very first time in American history, we're going to let the people decide whether they're free or slave instead of Congress. The reason the South likes this is because now they have the possibility of 5 new slave states, if you count Colorado. And so the South thinks that this is going to benefit them in the long run, and so that's why they're willing to compromise on number 1 and 2 on this slide, because they now know that they're going to be able to get perhaps as many as 5 more slave states in the West. Next, number 4, as part of something that goes along with the Compromise of 1850, we get new, stronger, stricter fugitive slave laws. So what does this mean the South can do? Slave catchers now have the authority, according to these new slave laws that are passed in 1850, they have the authority to use Northern police officers to help them catch slaves. In the past, slave catchers going into the South could only catch so many slaves because they're dispersed and they're hiding, and there's only so many slave catchers. Now, slave catchers have the right to force Northern police officers to help them go catch those runaway slaves. Northerners don't like this because they're the ones paying the taxes for these police officers, and what right does the South have to come up north and force our police officers, whose salaries we pay with our taxes, to help them catch slaves? And so this fugitive slave law is not going to be well received in the North. Next, the slave catchers also have the right to use Northern jails to house their slaves so they can go get more slaves. They don't have to keep an eye on them. And of course, the North doesn't like this, the Northern public, because who's paying for those Northern jails? Northerners are. And so we see again again, that the North will cry slaveocracy. They will say that the South is controlling our government. Now they're forcing us to help them catch slaves, and we don't like this. They're having their government and their institution come up north and affect the way we live. And so the Northerners just won't like this. Next, it's also going to corrupt the Northerners' judicial system. As part of the fugitive slave law, the law says that when a slave catcher catches a slave in the North, he has to grab that slave and then he takes him to a local judge. And in the past, the local judge would be 50-50, more or less likely to let the slave go because the slave would say, well, I'm a free man, I have my papers, and so the slave catcher would be disappointed. But this new, stronger fugitive slave law says that now the judges have an incentive to rule against the African American. The law will pay the judge twice as much for ruling that the African American is a runaway. And so we see that Northerners are upset because obviously judges are ruling that people are runaway instead of free men. And so we see judges being bribed, judges being corrupted, and the North simply doesn't like having this corruption in their government because of the South. Reaction. So as I said, the North does not like these rules, and so we see the North openly defying the new, stricter fugitive slave laws. Here we see an actual newspaper article. It says caution, and it's using a term that was used in that time to refer to African Americans. Caution, colored people of Boston, and it's warning them that there are slave catchers in the neighborhood and that the police have to help the slave catchers. So avoid the slave catchers, avoid the police, stay indoors, hide. Of course, this is a complete flagrant violation of the new, stricter fugitive slave laws, and when the South finds out about this, they get angry. And so the Compromise of 1850 and the fugitive slave law don't really solve all of our problems. We still see sectionalism. We still see the North and the South disagreeing about slavery. So here's an example of a political cartoon. Of course, one of the things you have to do in this class is talk about point of view. So let's take a moment and look at this political cartoon and try to figure out what the author's point of view is. What we see is we play I Spy, and so you see on the right-hand side of the picture, you see a man who's riding on top of the back of another man. He's holding some shackles that's linked to a lock, and he is also holding a lasso. So this man represents a slave catcher. Now, the person he's riding, the person who's helping him catch the slaves, he represents Congress. Congress passed these new fugitive slave laws to help the slave catchers catch runaways. On the left-hand side of the picture, looking very heroic, shielding the African American with his arm and also with his gun, we see Frederick Douglass in the back, and then we see the white abolitionist who's protecting her is William Lloyd Garrison. And so obviously the point of view of the cartoonist is to criticize these new slave laws because he makes the slave catcher look grotesque and ugly, then he makes William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass look heroic, and so that's the point of view of this artist. He's condemning the new fugitive slave laws by how he draws the picture. Next, Southern Manifest Destiny. Southern Manifest Destiny, just like Manifest Destiny, is the idea that America should get more land. The Southern twist on this is that it should be slave land. Number one, the Mexican-American War was so quick, so easy for the United States. It was perceived that way that the South is encouraged to go get more land. Well, look, if we got the northern third of Mexico so easy, why not the rest of Mexico? Why not Nicaragua? Why not Cuba? Why not all of South America? And so we see an increasing desire by Southerners to wage war on our Latino neighbors further south. We want more slave states. So let's talk about examples of that. Nicaragua. Nicaragua is going to be overthrown by an American acting on his own. He and some group of his, they don't have government sanction. His name is William Walker. He takes a bunch of his southern friends and they go down to Nicaragua and they overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Once they do this, then they write a letter to the United States and they say, hey, we want to be part of the United States. Take us, add us as another slave state. Of course, there is precedent for this. This is how Texas entered the Union. Americans overthrew the government and then joined the United States. And this is how California joined the Union. Americans overthrow the government of Mexico, create the Bear Flag Republic, and then it joins the United States. So that's what William Walker is hoping to do. Now, when the North finds out about this, the Northern public demands that we say no to William Walker. The North does not want a whole issue of slavery and civil war erupting again over the issue of Nicaragua, and so the United States government has to say no to William Walker, and Nicaragua eventually goes back to being under the control of the Nicaraguans. But it is an example of the South's attempt at manifest destiny. Next, Cuba. If you can look on this map, you can see just in the bottom right-hand corner the island of Cuba. And at this point, Cuba is a Spanish colony. Southerners look with covetous eyes at Cuba, and they think, wow, this is a ready-made, gift-wrapped southern state. It's just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's already got slavery in it. The Spanish used slaves to grow their sugar. It grows cash crops. This is a ready-made, new southern slave state. And so the government of the United States writes a letter to Spain. It's called the Ostend Manifesto. And in the manifesto, they say, why don't you sell us Cuba for $120 million, which, of course, is way more than we were willing to pay for California. That shows you the desperation of the South to try to get more slave states. Now, the negotiations were fairly well along, but then the Northern press gets a hold of this. They find out about this manifesto, they make it public, and the North raises such an uproar over this that they don't want another slave state that the president is forced to let the issue go. So we don't see that Cuba becomes another slave state. Now, our next slide has really nothing to do with Southern Manifest Destiny, so forgive me for putting it in this section, but I just didn't have any place else to put it. It's kind of unique at this time period. So I just snuck it in here. So make sure in your notes that you understand that this is not part of Southern Manifest Destiny. But what it is the United States, since we have California, now we want to be a power in the Pacific. We want to trade with China. The problem is that China is already at this time gobbled up and controlled by European powers. And so what we do is we thought, well, what's the next best thing? Let's try to trade with Japan. So the United States sends Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853. He gets to Japan, and the Japanese say, no, we're an isolationist society. We're not going to trade with you. But Commodore Matthew Perry says, well, I have a modern navy. You are going to trade with me. And he forces the Japanese to open up their ports to the United States and our trade. And so we see the United States becoming more and more involved in the Pacific, and we'll find that out in future lectures. Next, the railroad debate. Number one, it says need for. Since the United States now has a state way out west in California, and we have all of this land out west, the Mexican Cession, we want a railroad, a transcontinental railroad, a railroad across America to connect the east to the west. Now, the reason we need to do this is because we need to secure the West. We just got California, and we don't want to lose it back to Mexico, or we don't want to lose it to the British or the Russians. And so we decide that for military reasons, we need to have a transcontinental railroad so we can quickly get troops or reinforcements out west to hold on to California. Another reason we want a transcontinental road is because of economic integration. There are tremendous resources out west. There's gold, there's coal, there's lumber, food. We have all of these resources out west that the eastern cities need. And so it takes 6 months to get by railroad, by wagon train one way. And so we need a quicker way to get out west. And so there's this building desire to build a railroad across the United States to connect east to west. But the question is, where should that railroad go? We only have enough money, and that's barely, to build one railroad. Should we build a route that goes in the northern part of the Mexican Cession? Should we build a railroad that goes in the southern part of the Mexican Cession? Of course, this is going to lead to sectionalism yet again. So let's talk about the southern route. This is the proposed southern route. It's going to connect Houston to this small town called Los Angeles. Now, there are many benefits for this. If we do a southern route that connects one southern city to another southern city, this is going to be a huge boon for the southern economy. We're going to be able to see southerners get all those raw materials, maybe perhaps industrialize. In addition to that, southerners will easily be able to move out to Arizona and New Mexico, settling those areas, and according to popular sovereignty, then they could vote for slavery. So the South certainly wants a southern route. It's cheaper, too. Most of this route is on flat land, or it's in relatively low mountains. The Rocky Mountains get lower as you get to the southern border of the United States, and so it certainly would be cheaper and safer. The problem is that the best land to build the railroad on is currently owned by Mexico. You can see it in blue. That's blue section on the map. And so the United States goes to Mexico, and we organize the Gadsden Purchase. We're gonna buy from Mexico this chunk of land so we can build a future railroad possibly there. Of course, the Mexicans just lost to us in the Mexican-American War, and so they're not going to say no. And so they sell us the Gadsden Purchase. And so now we have this land just waiting there for us to build a railroad. So the Southerners in all Congress argue for this route. It's cheaper, we already have the land, and of course it's going to help us settle the West. The Northerners want their own route. They want a route that will connect Chicago to Omaha, and then as you can see on the map, Omaha to Ogden, and then from Ogden to San Francisco. And so they want this route, and that'll certainly be of benefit to the northern economy, getting all of those raw materials to the north, plus allowing a whole bunch of settlers to move into Kansas or Nebraska or Colorado. And so those states would be free. And so this would allow us to control the Senate even more. And so the North believes this will benefit them. It is expensive, even though some of it is flat. If you go the northern route, you're going to have to go over 2 mountain chains and deserts. You're going to have to go to the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada Mountains, plus you're going to have to go to the desert in between. So this would be a much more expensive route. So letter F, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This is a hugely important act in American history, one of the major causes of the Civil War. So Stephen Douglas, as we saw, he was on our cover slide, the little giant, what I call Mr. Popular Sovereignty. You need to know that he is a Democrat and he is from the state of Illinois. Now, Stephen Douglas, since he's from Chicago, he certainly wants a northern route. He is a northerner, and he knows that a northern route would benefit the northern economy. Plus, Stephen Douglas wants to be president someday. And in order to do that, he's going to have to get Northerners to view him as a hero, to view him as a person who looks out for their interests. So he believes that if he can get the railroad to be on the northern route, the northern wing of the Democratic Party will love him, and eventually they'll vote for him as president. The problem, though, is that if he does this, he's going to tick off all the Southern Democrats, which means he would never be president. To be president, you have to get Northern and Southern Democrats to like you. So what to do? So what he does is he proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So let's talk about how this is all tied to the railroad. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, what it would do is it would tear up the Missouri Compromise. Right? It would, if you remember, let's go back just a second. It would tear up the Missouri Compromise. If you remember, the Missouri Compromise said that the Louisiana Territory will be divided in half. At the 36-30 line, everything north of it will be free, everything south of it will be slave. And Stephen Douglas proposes with the Kansas-Nebraska Act that we'll just destroy that agreement, get rid of it, and we will open up all of this territory to popular sovereignty. He is Mr. Popular Sovereignty. So he said, just like what we did in the Compromise of 1850 with the Mexican Cession, let's do the same thing here in the Louisiana Territory. And so all of those territories that were formerly banned from slavery north of the 36-30 line, now they could be slave territory because it'll be popular sovereignty. So if enough Southerners move in north of the 36-30 line, they could vote, and Kansas could become a slave state, or so could Nebraska. This will make the South love Stephen Douglas, because now they have the possibility of a whole bunch of slave states. So the South votes for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Douglas has achieved his goal. The North is going to get their railroad, so he's popular with Northern Democrats, and the South loves the Kansas-Nebraska Act because now they have the possibility of getting more slave states in the Louisiana Territory that they didn't have before. So the South likes Stephen Douglas. He's perfectly positioned to run for the presidency in the future. So let's talk about this intense debate. Now, I already told you that it's going to pass, but let's talk about the arguments in both sides for and against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the South likes it. Like I said, they gain the possibility of more states for popular sovereignty in the future. And as we will see, Kansas is going to be the first piece of territory north of the 36-30 line that now has the possibility of being a slave state. The North hates the Kansas-Nebraska Act because they see it as a betrayal of the past. They see it as a betrayal of the Missouri Compromise. In the past, it was guaranteed that those northern farmers would get that land, that they wouldn't have to compete with southern plantation owners for land in Kansas or above. And so we're going to see lots of people in the North not liking the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's also, the North would say, an example of salocracy. Once again, the North is going to say that the southern slave owners are able to get their way. They're able to control the government, and so the slaveocracy, the slave interest, is controlling the United States. Next, the South likes the Kansas-Nebraska Act because there's more expansion for cotton. Southeast Kansas is very hot, very humid, and you certainly can grow cash crops there, so it'll allow the cotton industry to grow. Southern plantation owners like this. The North is going to be so angry about the Kansas-Nebraska Act that we're going to see the abolition movement grow. And here's the ironic thing, is that the more the South does to protect slavery or promote it or make it grow, the more abolitionists they make in the North as a response to that. Next, and this is perhaps the most important result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is that there's going to be a new political party formed just to get rid of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It is the Republican Party, the same Republican Party we have today. So the Republican Party starts as a protest against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and of course, just like the Free Soil Party, it is a purely sectional party. It is only found in the North, and it is really supported by Northern farmers. Next, it hurts the Democratic Party up north. Now, Stephen Douglas, if you remember, he was doing the Kansas-Nebraska Act so he could get popular with Northern Democrats up north and Southern Democrats down south, and he thought this would unite the party. In fact, it did just the opposite. The Democratic Party is going to start shrinking in the North. The Democrats up north are going to start to think that the Democratic Party is really just controlled by the South, and it's really just looking out for their interests. And so in the future, the Democratic Party, once again, just like the Whig Party, is going to be ripped apart because of this issue of slavery out west.